This is the sound of reverb. Thanks, Nick. As the great Jack Johnson once said, reverb is just a room. So if you think about a big cathedral versus a small room, you have very different sounds if you stand in the middle and clap. In the cathedral, when you clap, the sound waves leave your hand and shoot everywhere all around you, reflecting back at you, and that's what you hear, the signature sound of that room. If you're in a smaller space and you clap, it's much faster or shorter. So the bigger the space, the longer the decay is, and that's the time it takes for those reverberations to start and end. And the smaller the space, you'll have a shorter decay time. So how do we take a large room or cathedral on tour? Well, you don't. Through the power of witchcraft, we now have reverb in small pedal form boxes. The very first mechanical reverb device ever made was created by Bell Labs as a testing device to fix an issue they were having in long-distance phone calls. This was later picked up in 1939 by a guy named Lorenz Hammond, who installed it in his Hammond organs. People would buy a Hammond organ for their small church and noticed that it didn't sound like the big cathedrals in the cities they were near. When you plugged in this spring reverb unit to that Hammond organ, it gave it more fake space and dimension, making you feel like you were in a bigger environment than you were. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, a genre of music called surf rock comes to play with an artist named Dick Dell. Dick Dell started using these spring reverb units on his vocals, on his guitars, and it created a big, wet, spacey sound that we hear in the genre of surf rock. It just so happened that in this budding Orange County, California area where surf music was being created, Leo Fender had also established himself as a premier guitar and amplifier maker. Dick Dell became friends with Leo Fender and asked him to make this reverb unit into a guitar amp. So in 1961, Leo Fender leased the reverberation unit from Hammond organ and put it in the Fender Reverb head unit. This is simply a big, giant reverb pedal in a box. The foot switch was attached on the back. You could put it on the floor. And inside of it, it's some tubes, some circuitry, but most of all, a big spring tank. We can see here in the Sounds unit, this is what is actually inside of these. Coils of springs that the guitar signal travels through and is delayed, causing reverberation when mixed in parallel with the clean signal. There are many different types of reverbs beyond the spring reverb style, but let's cover the spring style first in pedal format. My favorite spring emulation reverb, it's made by Source Audio, and it is DSP. That means digital signal processing. So they have studied the springs and they have written code that allows you to perfectly replicate all the different variations and textures in a good spring reverb. This unit's phenomenal, and it is a favorite of ours here at JHS. In that spring domain, there are also actual pedals with springs in them. I mentioned the Sounds brand, who has different size tanks. You can have this large tank here, you can have a slightly smaller one, and then there's one even smaller than that. And you basically hook these into the control pedal, which has all the circuitry in it, and you can have a real spring unit like this mounted underneath your board. That's pretty cool. In the late 90s, Danelectro released the Spring King, and it even has a little pad here. And that's cool because springs, when they're in your amp or in a pedal, if you shake it or kick it, it makes a pretty violent, like, how would we describe the sound? It's like a milkshake made of metal, like a metal milkshake. Anyway, there's that. If you listen to a song called Deck's Dark by Radiohead, actually hear them where they sampled the shaking of a spring tank and put it in rhythm with the groove. It's one of my favorite songs. Another unit that just came out is the echofix spring reverb. It has a fancy meter on it, but again, this has a real spring in it, and this is a more manageable size and sounds pretty good. The next type of reverb that was developed was in 1957 by a German company named EMT. It was called the 140 reverberation unit, and essentially it's a big metal plate that sends the sound from one edge to the other, and this is called plate reverb. It's extremely famous in studio settings for vocals, for drums, and guitar, and you can find that inside of pedals now that are made with DSP. My favorite plate sound currently and probably forever is on the Bluesky by Strymon. The next type of reverb historically actually sounds really, really bad, but it should be mentioned that in the 1980s, specifically around 84 and 85, people tried to take Bucket Brigade delay chips and make reverb pedals by combining a bunch of delays to get those fake reflections in a place where it felt like reverb, but it was horrible. The FX45 by DoD and the stereo reverb by Arion were pretty unsuccessful, and DoD never even tried to make a reverb again. That's kind of how bad it sounds. The next type of reverb that comes along in popularity is during the 1980s, and this is hall reverb. And this is further made possible because digital signal processing, DSP, lets you do these big cascading reverbs that simulate a room. It's all done digitally, and we hear hall reverb all over the place in the 80s and the 90s. As far as my favorite hall setting, I guess it's the Holy Grail, but I mean, there is actually the Hall of Fame. Get it? Huh. It's a pun. And I think that our JHS 3 Series Hall reverb, that would actually be my favorite, but that's a bit of a shame. Don't buy this though. It's a really horrible pedal. If they try to buy these, shut the website down. Okay. Another reverb style effect that came to be around the early mid 80s and most notably recognized on a record by U2 called The Unforgettable Fire is the effect called Shimmer. This is essentially mixing high and or low octaves in with the reverb part of the effect, leaving the dry signal dry, but on the decay and reverberation of these digital reverbs, a guy named Brian Eno would insert octave effects. So this is called Shimmer. We have one called Octave Reverb, another shameless plug, don't buy it. As far as my favorite Shimmer reverbs, there's a ton, but again, Strymon's really great at this. It says Shimmer, you put the switch down, it's very tweakable. I love unorthodox kind of crazy approaches to Shimmer. Some of my favorite are by Old Blood Noise Endeavors. You'll see on the flat light and the dark star, they'll have modes that say detune, or on this one, pitch. And really, Shimmer is all about adding some type of pitch and modulation that's up an octave above or so, or moving to the reverb path. Almost every multi-reverb from a company like Boss or Electro Harmonics is going to have a Shimmer style in it. Reverb is the most commonly used effect of all time. It's on vocals, it's on drums, it's even on bass tracks, it's on the master mixes of some songs. So to identify what's a good song with reverb, it's a little difficult sometimes because it's all over the place, but I definitely have some favorite songs I'll share with you to listen to. Number one is going to be John Mayer's Slow Dancing in a Burning Room. I think it's like one of the most beautiful and perfect applications of spring reverb that there is. Next up is the Twin Peaks theme song. It's awesome. It's got that crazy tick-tacky baritone thing. It's kind of surfy and eerie, and reverb really makes the whole thing feel like it should feel. And then last but not least would be the song Sorrow by Pink Floyd. Not enough. get to hear a bigger non-spring thing, probably a digital hall reverb used in the studio. Some other honorable mentions if you're on the hunt for the ultimate reverb for your rig would be the Ocean's 11 by Electro-Harmonix. This is a multi-reverb. It has a ton of stuff. Really, everything you need is inside of this. And there's an even fancier version if you want to go that way. Any of the Boss RV series, I actually have the RV6 on one of my personal boards, so I'm having to hold the RV5. It's equally awesome. You can find it on the used market. And then specifically with spring reverb, because it's a very picky effect. Sometimes spring reverbs don't sound like spring reverbs when people try to do it in a pedal, but I really do think that these work well. This is the Topanga by Catlin Bread. It is a spring reverb emulation. It's done again with DSP. And then we have the TC Electronics Drip. This refers to a thing that spring does. When you hit it, it splashes, kind of like this reverberated sound, and then at the end of it, you actually can hear a type of drip sound. Now, this is when someone really gets it right, and this pedal's named after it and does it really well. We also made a pedal back in the day, the Spring Tank. It's crazy, it has an effects loop, it's got 2 different tanks on it, but we don't make it anymore. You can find it on the used market. And then last but not least, the 3 Series Reverb. If you just want a reverb and you're not too concerned with the genre of reverb, this does a lot of different sounds, especially in a band mix. I've used it to get a springish sound, a hall type thing, and if you crank it up really wildly with the settings kind of maxed out, you can get an endless ambient thing going as well. When you do find that reverb that you really love, just place it at the end of your chain. That is the most commonly accepted and safest place to put a reverb effect. You can try putting it before your distortions and different things because that's fun and you should just try stuff, but put it last, see if you like it, and then play around later. Thanks so much for watching. Reverb's awesome, and you definitely need to buy 3 to 10 of them. If you like this type of content, hit like and let us know in the comments below, and you can also subscribe to the channel. Have a wonderful day.